I would like to re-acknowledge, first and foremost, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land from which I and Kavita are broadcasting to you respectively. And of course, I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to thank them for their continued hospitality on this stolen land. My name is Jennifer Down. After all of that, I'm facilitating the Toolkits Fiction program this year, and tonight I have the utter pleasure of speaking with Kavita Bedford, who is the author of the recently published Friends and Dark Shapes. Kavita, by way of introduction, is an Indian-Australian writer with a background in journalism, anthropology and literature. Her writing has appeared in Guernica, The Guardian and The Griffith Review, and she was also a recent Churchill Fellow exploring migrant narratives. She works and teaches in Sydney, media and global studies. Friends in Dark Shapes is available through Text Publishing in Australia and was just this week, yesterday, is that correct? Published in the US?
It's published today, yeah. Today is official publication day in US.
Happy book birthday in the States. It's available. If any of you watching have pals in the US, they can get it through Europe editions. And I saw that it already got a call out in the New York Times, which is huge. Congratulations.
Wow. Thank you so much. So exciting.
Yeah. Oh, it's so deserve it. It's really one of the favorite books that I have read this year so far.
Thank you.
So before we dive into questions, a little bit of housekeeping. My apologies. I will keep it as brief as possible. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, Toolkits is an intensive 12-week course for writers under 30 to develop their skills in a unique digitally based environment. I'm personally passionate about it because it means that young people who may not otherwise have access to things like workshops, feedback, or a community of like-minded peers, whether through their geographic location, for mobility or financial reasons, whatever, it means that anybody can participate as long as they have Wi-Fi. Toolkits is generously supported by the copyright agency Cultural Fund and is run by Express Media, who you might have heard of them. They've been around for over 30 years, developing, supporting and promoting young writers through workshops that develop skills, through opportunities that provide constructive feedback and also publication like VoiceWorks, and also through awards and programs that recognise excellence. So this year, during April? No, April's gone. Through May and June this year, rather, we're bringing a live season of broadcasts for anyone to tune into each fortnight, even those of you who are not participating in Toolkits. And these will be from our fiction, non-fiction and graphic narratives program. So tonight is actually our very first live broadcast. You never would have guessed after that impeccably smooth start. Rest assured that each of these sessions will be available on YouTube in perpetuity, which is a little bit frightening. They'll also be captioned in the coming days. What else? We welcome questions. We would love them. Please ask away. You can submit your questions on Twitter using the hashtag ENToolkits or via the live chat section under this video on YouTube. We're especially keen on any questions you might have about voice and dialogue because that is what we are talking about this week. I think that's all of my admin. I feel like I really just breathlessly rushed through it. Let's get cracking. So Friends and Dark Shapes follows a group of 20-somethings who live in Sydney. These are friends and housemates over a period of a year or so. It's told through the eyes of our unnamed narrator in this very fragmentary style, so that I guess our sense of her as a protagonist is constructed through these sequences, some of which are longer and some of which are quite fleeting, that gradually build to a full and meaningful picture, kind of like an impressionist painting or a work of collage, I suppose. I don't want to be too technical, but since we're talking about voice, I think it bears noting that this novel is written in this first person and present tense voice, which gives it both a sense of immediacy, but also a sense of intimacy or closeness. We're always in the middle of the action, and we're also always with the narrator. I wondered if you could speak a little bit about where that voice kind of came from or how it developed, Kavita?
Yeah, sure. I also just wanted to say one of my very first writing pieces that got published was in VoiceWorks.
Oh, me too.
Yeah. So it's so wonderful and lovely, like full circle to come around and be here as well tonight with everyone. Yeah, I'm really passionate about the work that you guys do. Yeah, so in terms of the decision to make it a first person narrator, that came fairly quickly in the picture for me. I think I always knew it was going to be a first person kind of story. And a lot of that was, I mean, there was a mixture of reasons behind it. Partly was what I was reading a lot of. And I've become quite obsessed in the last few years with first person, fragmentary writing, female voice driven work. And you never guess it, but quite short chapters as well. So lo and behold, what I ended up producing was also, and it was something that I really wanted to try out. And I think when I sort of came, you know, we can talk in more detail, but when I came to a lot of these writers and these stories, it was like this huge aha moment for me. I think I'd been grappling a lot with trying to formulate structures and plots in a very different way, or maybe slightly more traditional kind of novel way, which for partly for craft and partly through my sensibility were just things that I really grappled with, and sort of they weren't telling the particular story that I wanted to tell didn't seem to fit into those molds. And when I sort of came to reading a lot of these people's work and figuring out things, it was just this amazing kind of opening up, and something kind of settled in me where it felt like this would be something really joyful and interesting as well. Like it's quite experimental. And, you know, what it set out to do was something a bit different to a kind of classic novel. So a lot of these things, and then also the fact that there were elements of telling a story that was definitely, there's personal elements in there, but also wanting to keep it in a fiction space. And those were decisions as well that, you know, that we can talk to about, like, because at the beginning there were aspects where there was almost at one point in a very early iteration, it was looking like something like a memoir, and how to actually wrestle it out of that memoir space and turn it into something like fiction and what that involves. But all of those kind of meant that in some ways it wasn't a huge decision to choose that kind of first person narration. And the voice was the thing that once I got the voice, everything kind of followed. So yeah, so that I think, as opposed to sometimes when, you know, if I've come to short stories or other things I've written, you almost think through a little bit, almost more conceptually or theoretically, almost academically, like, oh, what will I try, or what's going to be the way that this molds. But this particular story for personal, and then also for the kind of things I wanted to explore, it just had to be a first person narrator.
Yes. It works beautifully. I think also there was something really lovely. I don't want to butcher your words, but there was something really lovely that you said about feeling that sense of settling, like not settling in a bad way, but settling in the sense of kind of comfort with that narrative or style choice. And I think that's exactly what it feels like when you find the way into the story, whether it's through the voice or through the character or the setting. There's this beautiful sense of like, oh, now I can do the work, and it's kind of washing over you. It's like, you know,
absolutely. Yeah. And all those kind of, it's like this quite antsy energy that is sort of pulsating, and depending on who you are. But for me, for years, I'm quite a slow writer, or this novel was quite a long haul. Yeah. And I knew all these things, but they just weren't gelling for years. And so exactly what you say, you know, sometimes it's the character, sometimes it's the plot. But for me, it was voice.
Lovely. There's something, if we could, go back to that sort of the style of the novel, which, you know, I called it fragmentary before. I know that Jenny Offal has spoken very deserved and high praise of your novel. And that's what it kind of reminds me of. We've spoken about Jenny Offal actually in a few of our close, that's not the right word, but the non-live classes. And yeah, there's something really lovely about that style in how it gives you just sort of these fleeting moments or these flashes into a character's life or a family setting or whatever it is. But I was thinking about this in terms of, and I guess how it interacts with the use of the present tense narrative voice, because for me there was something really cinematic about it. And I think maybe this sounds obvious, but I think it's because that's precisely how screenplays are written. You know, everything's happening right now. And in screenwriting, you always want to enter the scene after the action has begun and exit the scene, you know, before the action wraps up. And I wondered whether, was that sort of always how you intended for the story to be told?
No, it's really interesting that as well. A few people have observed that since, which has been quite fun. I think so. I mean, going back to the first early part, it was really, well, it's actually just really amazing and full circle with Jenny Offal as well, because she was one of the writers that when Department of Speculation came out, specifically, because that was around the time that I was sort of starting to do things. And that book, I sat with a pen and just jotted out the arc of that story, because it's this super fragmentary kind of way of approaching. But what she does and what she actually really taught me through just the book was being so careful about every sentence and making every sentence absolutely count. And so it's quite sparse writing, but I felt like this real joy because it was almost like not needing to waste words getting from one scene to another. And for me, that was really enjoyable, the idea that I could just have these kind of like sparse, stark, and kind of rounded ideas, and then almost not trouble oneself with that movement and all the what felt like quite clunky almost moving into, you know, well, this, how would they get from that to there to this? So she was actually someone who was really incredibly formative actually for my kind of writing time. And, you know, I think also being a young female writer, there was a lot of, I think this episodic fragmentary kind of style lends itself in a lot of ways to kind of feminine experiences and thoughts as well. And there was something incredibly freeing when I thought that one could write like that. And that I enjoyed reading it so much first and foremost. You know, it wasn't just an experiment. Like, that's what actually I responded to so strongly. But then that I could also have the freedom to, and call something a novel. That was an exploration of ideas kind of in those episodic and fragmentary ways. So I kind of came at it with that. And I think there was there'd been so much, and I mean, I think this is the writing path, and then I think this is the feminine path. There'd just been so much doubting for so many years in writing, so much doubting. And I'd always kind of written, but I just would always write these sort of short episodic things and then think, and I've still got, you know, a ton of things on my laptop that I just would be like, but I don't know where it leads or what it's supposed to be. So seeing suddenly this form being played with, and I think Jenny Offal is one of them, but quite a lot of, I also loved reading Valeria Luiselli and Sidewalks. Her work there was incredibly formative as well, which is kind of a bit of a female flaneur kind of, you know, novel, but also these really profound philosophical ideas, and the idea that one could weave in formed and an exploration that was quite theoretically, and then weave that through into sort of storylines from a female perspective, which is something quite specific. Those started to open up things for me. So I didn't actually come in thinking so much filmic in a film kind of way. I came in thinking, though, of contained scenes.
Yes.
So I think that then has, you know, the way we know that form is often in scripts.
Yes.
So it makes a lot of sense. And I think there might be something quite natural in that as well. My kind of early years was a lot in theatre. So,
which is, again, it's not the same as cinema, but the same principles apply where you don't want to waste. I think we like to imagine that you get a bit more, you're prepared to forgive a bit more guff in a novel. I think that's true. Generally we are, because we know that there's, you know, action coming, whereas in something like a short story or theatre or cinema, you really can't afford to waste any words or dialogue or action, because the viewer or the audience will lose interest like that.
Yeah, but it was so funny because I was in theatre for a long time, and my first job was working for a currency press, so a performing arts publisher. And so I used to read like every day, like in my job there, I would read about 3 plays a day. Um, and it's so funny though, because then when I came to my own writing path, and when I started to think, oh, it's literature, I thought, oh, I'm not allowed to do that. And I had a very strong sense for many years of what I was allowed and what I was not allowed to do. And there was this real sense of permission and authority, and and some of them are real in the sense of like any craft, learn the guidelines, of course. You don't want to be breaking things straight away necessarily until you've kind of worked things out. But there was something a little bit extra in it, which was around this kind of like permission. And I think when one of it's self-permission, but also when I sort of read other women writers who were just breaking that, and it was suddenly like really dynamic and felt really fresh and felt like the most interesting things that I was reading going around. Suddenly the old script writing and old script ways kind of like snuck back in, I think.
I think there's also like the other side of, you talked about self-doubt before, right? And this idea that we don't need to show the reader everything. That idea that you mentioned, Jenny Offal, as having really cemented for you, that you don't have to show necessarily the mechanics of things happening or characters, getting from A to B, perhaps in the literal sense, but also just like figuratively speaking, the sort of mechanics of plot. We don't always need to see that as a reader. Sometimes we do. Sometimes it needs to be explained to us, but often like we can leave out things and trust that the reader can fill in the gaps. But I think that trust is sort of the other side of the coin of self-doubt that you're talking about. And some of it comes from ourselves, and some of it also comes from, being a strong enough writer, or strong is not quite the right word, but having enough control as a writer to be confident that you are leaving, that what is on the page does the job and kind of guides the reader to draw the right conclusions and make the right assumptions about what happens when we're not on the page, we're not with the character. It kind of lets you extrapolate things out a little bit, but it takes a while to learn. And also I think it's so much to do with like confidence or something, because you're like, well, I can't trust the reader if I haven't done a good job. That's what I always think. I have to spell things out for the reader because I haven't done a good enough job. And so I think I don't think that, certainly for me, that self-doubt has never gone away, but I think it does get a bit easier as you are more experienced. You can start to work out where you're second guessing yourself.
Yeah, and I think they run very closely in tandem with each other, right? Kind of, for one of, not making it sound like some therapy session, but kind of the self-knowledge anyway that runs in tandem with actually like growing any craft, but especially something like writing, where you are sort of going into all the corners and grooves of your mind so much, and you need to know thyself, but also work out when sometimes, just to call bullshit on your ego a lot of the time as well. And I think that's a really important thing, and that comes with time, as does then through that practicing this kind of daily writing, or however your practice is. But for me, certainly making the language and writing as strong as possible. All those crippling self-doubt things, I couldn't have written this book without that. Like it just would have been impossible. I couldn't have it wasn't just about going, aha, there's the formula or the structure that I want to write it in, and I can just impose it. It was so much practice of learning how to write sentences and how to just put words together.
And I think it's that thing of like the form can't dictate the story. Like the form, you used the word superimposed just before, and I think that's kind of perfect. You can't kind of superimpose a structure that won't work onto a story just because you saw somebody else do it and you liked it, or because it's kind of gimmicky. Sounds mean, but sometimes we see these things and that we're like, I want to try that, and actually it doesn't suit the story you're writing. But it's kind of a painful process to work that out. Sometimes you have to you have to kind of be very honest with yourself and acknowledge that actually the story that you're that you're writing, or the story that you want to tell needs to have a different shape, perhaps, than the one that you want it to.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think that's a huge realization. And I don't know what it was like for, I mean, many of your novels now. But for me, I mean, I wrote the first version of this book, which was something totally different. And I wrote it for 4 years, 3.5 years.
Mm.
And, you know, at the end of it, and it was the most painful thing to realize, it was a really gimmicky novel. It was.
Yeah.
And it was also trying to cram, you know, I think like a lot of first-time novelists, every single thought I ever had into one form.
Yeah.
So, I mean, like if you can imagine the book that is now, but also put in Greek mythology, also put in birds, also put in splayed timelines, you know, like it just was going for everything. But part of it was I'd seen forms where that stuff worked.
Yes.
And so I tried to emulate it, which we have to do, like copy.
Yeah, totally.
But it didn't work, and it was one of my really good and very trusted friends, I don't think anyone else could have said it, who read it with love and care and a lot of kindness and then said, "Do you think it's working?" And I just broke into tears and I was like, "No, it's not." But I just was so desperate for it to be done. And so this book now is a complete rewrite that took a year, but a complete and utter rewrite of that old thing. So yeah, there's a lot of letting go as well. And like you're saying, you know, even if you see a beautiful form and idea, it doesn't mean you can always do it.
No, and like it might work for something that you're working on in the future, but it's kind of a process of brutal honesty and asking yourself, like, do I just really like this? Do I want to be this person, or do am I in love with them? It's the same thing. It's like, do I want to use this structure, or do I just really, does something about it really kind of speak to me as a reader?
Yeah.
We actually, have a question. I'm curious about what Kavita learned about dialogue from reading plays, especially plays that rely more heavily on dialogue, one-handers plays with minimal staging. This is good because I wanted to move into talking about dialogue or move away from talking about narrative voice and move into dialogue. So maybe this is a nice little segue.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it was really interesting. I think there was a kind of mixture because I was going to plays a lot at the time, which was wonderful. And so there was the act of actually seeing a play and, you know, with the staging and the whole process and the whole production and then the actors and the costumes and everything. But then I was, like your question says, I was actually just reading a lot of plays, mainly because they were in the room where I worked, and I just was kind of picking them up and I was always hungry to read. And I think it was a really fantastic entry point into dialogue. And I think a lot of things, and also reading bad plays was really wonderful. And it's like reading bad literature as well, because it would start to, some things at work, even when you don't realize it. Like I wasn't always consciously trying to suss this stuff out, but I think realizing what dialogue just sounded authentic.
Yeah.
Like what dialogue actually sounded like, oh, I can believe that conversation, versus then reading some plays that just felt very hammed up, or for want of a better word, but very dramatic. But also through it working out what I liked. And I think that's so much of reading as well, isn't it? Because it's not even just always saying, because there was stuff that it was trying to fit into a genre. And so it was actually perfect dialogue for that genre. But maybe I didn't like it. And then I would sort of find myself nutting out and trying to figure out, well, why don't I like it? And just sort of those self-questions that sometimes were quite idle. You know, I might be eating a sandwich or, you know, doing something else. And it wasn't kind of like some, you know, massive interrogation and I was taking notes on everything. But I think just reading so much dialogue, and it is really interesting because coming to writing later, nothing that I always had this joke with people, not a joke, it wasn't very funny. I always just said this thing with a lot of friends and stuff where I actually was always like, I will do anything to avoid my characters speaking in stories.
Wow. But dialogue and conversations are such a huge part of this book.
Yeah. And I hated writing dialogue. And I used to have these short stories where like the most insane things would take place just to avoid that person saying anything to the other person. And part of it was because I felt like I had to do the mechanics of like, hi, how are you? What's
Yes.
happening? Are you going to this party? No. Okay, well, maybe I can see you the next day. And I'd just be like, oh, this is awful. Like, why won't anyone get to anything? And it was sort of through, so it was interesting when I found that writing could be embedded, or dialogue could be embedded in the rest of the story. That was really helpful. And then suddenly all those lessons that I thought and I was always weirded out because I was always like, I loved theatre, but I hate writing dialogue and I will never write dialogue. And then as I was writing this book, all that kind of old reading and training and stuff just kicked in. And I'm obsessed with it. Now all I want is my characters to just talk to each other, and I want to let go of like setting now. And I'm like, oh, it's always one or the other.
I think it's exactly the same thing as what you were saying a couple of minutes ago about learning how, or letting go of having to show the mechanics of things, or show people show people getting up in the morning. Like there's that. I always say, like, don't start a story with the character getting up, like, unless you have a really compelling reason to. Like, I can't even think of how compelling it would be.
Yeah, it's so
it's the same thing with dialogue. Like, you don't need to show them being like, hey, what's up? All of that stuff. Or, you don't need to show them hanging up at the end of a phone call. It's, and I think it's really liberating, but it's all kind of the same thing, isn't it? Like learning how much we can get away with not saying and still have the reader understand what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was so funny. I did it once in my undergrad. I went to one script writing class and I was by far the worst. Like I just couldn't do it. And it was again this sort of idea that like I just had to have everything spelt out. And so reading plays does help because watch where they start things.
Yeah.
And you can take that same formulation into literature, which is really wonderful.
I think the other beautiful thing about screenplays, and I wanted to ask you about this as well, when you read a script, a play script or a screenplay, the stuff that is not dialogue, the non-verbal cues, and you can tell that I never studied theatre because I'm struggling to what's it called? The direction, basically.
Oh, like the stage notes and everything?
The stage notes, thank
you.
Yeah. All of that stuff can really inform like character choices and the tone, how something is said. And there's a lot left off the page, but if a playwright or a screenwriter really wants to make a point, they'll say, so and so turns her head, or so and so moved to the side of the kitchen, whatever it is. And I wanted to ask you about, like, I think sometimes when we conceive of dialogue, we think of literally the back and forth, what is said, but so much of dialogue is what is not said, or what is said and misinterpreted, or what we joke about, but actually, it's not funny, or it's quite painful. And then things like body language and those like non-verbal cues. How did you come to feel so comfortable with those? Because that's also such a beautiful and huge part of this novel.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, it's just looking at so many different forms of language, isn't it?
Yeah.
Like we're looking at, what is said, what isn't said, body language, landscape informing being. Like all of these are kind of very different rhythms and different. I mean, it's why I love literature so much, because it's this place where you get to explore. It's almost like the generosity that you get to actually play with every single one of them. Like you don't have to limit yourself out like you might with script, for example, where you just have to opt out of dictating everything at one point. And I guess I did think about those things. I mean, so much as if you have read or haven't read the book, for me, a lot of the book was about a certain rhythm. So I wrote all these sentences which in this particular rhythm that's in my head. And and it has a very he said, she says, he says, she says kind of formulation to it. And within that, dialogue is embedded within it. So it'll be like he says da 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 da, but she says don't.
Yes.
He says da 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 da, but she says no. So it's got that thing, and having that allowed me to put that's where kind of the spoken dialogue could take place.
Mm-hmm.
But because it would be embedded, sometimes I could use that he says, she says, but have actual descriptions around it.
Yes.
It's sort of hard without fully having the book, but it's got this kind of way which for me, again, was freeing, but also allowed for things like, it allowed for me to say the way something was said, or if a silence wanted to take place, or if there was heat on the skin, or, you know, any of these moments, it allowed that to take place in that formulation. So
yes.
having some limitations was really helpful. And it also kind of meant for me that the thing that they could say in the middle didn't ever have to be, it could be just a line that would be taken from a middle of a conversation.
Yes.
So I never had to set up, and I don't know if you know, but like none of the dialogue that takes place in any of it is really ever set up from beginning to end.
No, it's all very like in media res, like it just,
yeah,
it's like a cutaway.
Yeah, so that kind of allowed, because I could write around it, as opposed to, I'm trying to think of, as opposed to having, say, dialogue where you might have the quotation marks and
Yes.
then the comma, he said.
Yes.
This was she says, da 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 da, he says, da 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 da, but then we all went to the bar.
Yes, of course, because forgetting that you don't use quotation marks.
Yeah, so no quotation marks.
Yeah. So that's a really important thing to kind of navigate. Doing that successfully is actually, like, people think sometimes that using or not using quotation marks is kind of just like a fun style thing, like choosing a font, but it actually has really big ramifications for how you tell a story, because if you don't have those clear like literal visual signifiers, you have to make other concessions, but also not feel like you're doing it. It can't impede upon the story or the dialogue.
Yeah, totally. And you have to make a lot of things very clear about when he says or she says.
Yes.
Sometimes it's not always clear, went through that like so many times, making sure it's very clear who was saying what.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's, and that was it was a very set decision. It wasn't just, like you say, kind of a fun thing. I mean, it was a fun thing to do and to try out, but yeah, there were very specific reasons. And part of it for me was because of rhythm. Mm-hmm. And I felt that if I started to put quotation marks, suddenly I'd have to move where I put the dialogue in the sentence, and that would shift the whole cadence for me.
Yeah.
So those were kind of very set decisions. And I think that that's what allowed me to then also play with the other language, like you say, about silence or bodily moments and internal dialogue as well, versus said dialogue.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I've done both. My first book in short stories used quotation marks, and the most recent thing I've written doesn't, and it definitely has challenges. But I always think it's funny when I read like a review online of a book and somebody's like, I was distracted by it, because he didn't use punctuation or whatever. And it's like, like the author didn't do it to piss you off or to like make life harder. It's just like, that's like, it is by necessity a very conscious stylistic choice that has repercussions for, things at the most minute sentence level, and often not having those speech tags, it can make things really complicated. And it always kind of makes me laugh when people like take it as a personal affront that, there's no speech punctuation, because I'm like, well, like,
oh my God, there are so many opinions about it. It's quite hilarious. It's very divisive. And some people are sort of saying, oh, new literature that's doing this, it's too much. And
It's
But
so
like
funny.
you said, you used it in your first novel. You're not using it in this one. Who knows in the third? Same for me. It's not going to be like every single thing I write. Although I really enjoyed it. I actually really enjoyed how precisely it made me think about sentences. And I really, yeah, like there's something to it that, because you have to be making so many decisions, like to write once, I don't know if you find this, but to write one sentence takes a lot longer in some ways, because you're making those decisions. But then I feel like once the sentence is out, it's so clean.
I think that, and I am aware that I might sound like a nutty person, but there is also something about quotation marks as like visual clutter, which they are not. I read them and I understand what they are, and I don't notice them most of the time in other people's work, you know, unless they're really, I don't know, outlandish, or like sometimes, you know, when you're reading like an American book and they have strange style choices that, you know, will trip you up, or they'll trip someone like me up who notices neurotic shit like that. But I think when I'm writing, it's like I don't want there to be any impediment to the story. I just wanted it to kind of roll out and to feel very fluid. And so that is another time when I will choose not to use those quotation marks, is because I don't know what it is, but it's the smallest. It's not even a beat. Like, I don't think we even really notice them as readers most of the time. But when I'm doing work, I'm like, oh no, that's too great an impediment to what's actually, you know, existing between those marks.
I have the same nutty thing, and I started to feel like the equivalent of, you know, washing my hands constantly with things like commas and quotation marks, and I would just be like, it all has to be very clean. Like I just became, and it's for this book. Like I don't know if that's going to be the mode for everything, but for this book, I just kept saying it, and it sounded probably really nuts to the editors as well. I just kept being like, I just want everything really clean.
Like, no, I think I don't know. But I'm obviously a sympathizer here. Can I ask, I like to ask other writers this, irrespective of what we're talking about, but it happens to fit. Are you an eavesdropper?
Yes.
Yeah. And do your friends ever worry that you'll fictionalize like conversations that you have with them?
Yes. Especially more so since the book came out. So, you know, and it's been interesting because there have been lots of friends and stuff. I've been getting lots of people saying, oh, you know, I was at that party. I've gone, that party didn't exist. It didn't really happen, but that's wonderful that it felt that real, because it's kind of like every one of those parties, you know. So that's kind of been funny with people trying to, you know, work out exactly, you know, or was I there at that one? I think I remember that guy. Yeah. That stuff has definitely happened. But eavesdropping, I do, and what did feel like a curse now feels like the best thing, because that's helped me write dialogue so much.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, people often talk about having an ear for dialogue, or like, and I kind of tend to think it's something that, I mean, I'm sure some people are more attuned to it naturally, but I think it is one of those, fortunately, skills that you can practice and get better at. And there are complicated moral questions with eavesdropping, but as a fellow eavesdropper, I think you can just learn so much from listening to other people talk, and how not even the content necessarily of their conversation, but the way they modulate tone and the way they change word use. Like I think I tend to eavesdrop from quite a clinical perspective, but I'm always like fascinated by people who will get on public transport and have a really loud phone conversation when they clearly want to signal like importance, or you know, some kind of like, you know, what they do is crucial. And I'm always like, what does that say about you? Like, I'm sure you wouldn't be yelling like this if you were just walking down the street, or maybe you would, but they want everybody to know that what they do is very important, and they're making a lot of money, and their clients are very happy, whatever it is. That stuff is so fascinating to me, like the way that our choice of words and the volume at which we speak and our tone of voice and our, you know, the way we gesticulate, all of that is, you know, we think it's kind of, I don't want to say unconscious, but it happens very quickly, and a lot of it is very reflexive very few of us like make a decision to gesture. It's usually done in support of what we're speaking about, and it feels very natural. But at some point, there is some lizard part of our brain that is making those decisions, and I think it's so fascinating eavesdropping, especially on strangers, when you don't have that, the context or the knowledge of what they're actually like, beyond what you're seeing. Are you a note taker?
Yeah, I am.
I love it.
A lot of the book was written based from notes that I took on my iPhone.
Yes.
So I used to take, and I had so many just one-liners all through my phone that I had no idea for a long time what it was going to go to or what it was for. And I'm so happy I did that, because then when it came to writing scenes with dialogue years later as well, I'd suddenly think, oh, there's a really authentic way that I can say that thing that I'm trying to sit here in, my bedroom or wherever it is and write. Actually, like, I heard this exact line, and
Yes.
and it was said so much better. And I think a lot in rhythms.
Mm-hmm.
And so I love repetition, and I love some sentences. I love everyday kind of poetry. So
Yeah.
I love that. Those unexpected moments, and where people defy your expectations. And I love the way stereotypes work. So we have these kind of preconceived ideas of, when a bouncer just says pure poetry to you from a simple way. And, or you have these kind of deep conversations with your Uber driver, or, but I love those kind of little moments and those lines that, and I think it is something that you can develop. Partly through listening. I also think reading stuff that lifts that up, as its art form. So rather than this kind of, and I guess that goes back to those kind of scripts and stuff I was reading early on and working out what I liked, because I didn't necessarily love the kind of, so much of writing is about trying to make things simpler as well, right? And how hard it is to do anything with simplicity. Like, it's the hardest thing ever. It's actually really easy to write a complicated sentence, or it's really actually quite easy to write complicated dialogue.
Yeah.
But writing very simple, clean again, becoming, and very true sounding sentences and lines, I think does have to come from a lot of research.
Yes, I agree. And practice as well. There are so many. Obviously, it's kind of a Friends in Dark Shapes is spoken or told to us through this kind of singular first-person narrative. But there are so many characters. There are a lot of characters in the book. Some of them we only meet once or twice, and then there are kind of characters who either recur, like our narrator's housemates, or characters who we kind of, obviously at the start of the book, her father has passed away, but we kind of meet him through her memories. And her mother, who is, really absent for most of the book, we still have a sense of her, again, through both memory and the way this narrator thinks about her mother. I wondered, how one of the really beautiful things about all of these characters is that they don't all sound the same, which maybe sounds obvious, but I've read a lot of really great contemporary fiction where, it can be a really good book, but at some level the characters all speak with the same voice.
And yeah, totally.
It's this kind of giveaway. It doesn't make me hate the book, but I do notice it, and I do kind of go, oh. But I'm curious, how did you approach writing such diverse characters without resorting to those stereotypes, or I don't want to say hammy accents, but that those kind of I guess more obvious markers of things like identity, whether it's class, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, age?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think, again, it's a answer that has a couple of strands to it. I think one which is really important, the strand, was I worked for several years before writing this book. I was working in the anti-racism space. And one of the projects that I began by doing was I was actually writing I'd set up a kind of website where we were collecting a lot of stories and trying to engage stories from southwestern Sydney. And a lot of it was to get the kind of stories that the mainstream media, won't or doesn't tell, and give sort of migrants, refugees, but also just people from the community, like without these labels, just people from regions in Sydney that are not looked at. So I was spending a lot of my time, and I worked as a journalist in this kind of space for many years. So I've spent, and also through my work in anthropology, I've spent so much time interviewing people.
Yeah.
And I've spent so much time listening to people, which is such a beautiful thing to do. And I worked for years, I worked in Indonesia, where I was also kind of working with women from rural communities. I worked as an anthropologist where I was collecting a lot of stories for, stuff around the city. And then I was working in southwestern Sydney. And then I was working for the World Bank for a while, and I was collecting stories to go into their reports. Basically, every job, I've moved across so many different fields, but every single job I've had, the thing that I've always been given as my task has been to interview people and to try and get their voices and their stories into whatever that main program is. So I then also worked for government, and I was interviewing a lot of people, kind of disenfranchised young people, and people from different communities. The project was looking at how local diaspora communities were impacted by events going on in Syria and Iraq specifically. And so I was talking a lot with communities and people who've lost a lot or who have felt trauma, but also who are just really doing kind of incredible things with their own families and their own lives, and had really distinct personalities. And so over the years, I was just, and there was no agenda apart from the thing that I was doing. But what it was doing was I just feel so honoured. But I've just been spending a lot of time with a really broad cross-section of society whose stories don't generally tend to get told.
Yes.
And when they do get told, they're put, like you said, into these very kind of standardised narratives or an idea of what the mainstream think these people are.
Well, there's that great line, sorry to interrupt you, but there's that great bit in the in Friends in Dark Shapes when the line about things, mainstream media only being interested in like migrant stories if it can be packaged into like a BuzzFeed listicle or something. I'm misquoting it, I'm sorry, but it's something like that. And I think it's totally true.
Yeah, totally. And so I guess a very big part of when I wanted to write this book, I really wanted to write a book about Sydney. And I really wanted it to have voices that, yes, I never saw. So that was a really, really big part, but also that didn't feel like they were so plucked out of some obscure thing. It didn't feel like I was doing some active representation, because these were the people I was talking with. And I knew their voices and I knew the things that preoccupied, and I wanted characters who didn't fit into any of those neat kind of stories. The refugee who has overcome and is now just really grateful about Australia, or, the migrant who works really hard. Again, I mean, most of the stories are kind of ending in some kind of gratitude model. But I wanted stories as well where it was kind of, a lot of it were kind of young, hipster, contradictory characters who were also part of the problem as much as, they're complicit in a whole, for the novel talks and goes into a lot of issues around class and gentrification. And I wanted to bring very subtly, but I wanted to bring up issues around migrants who know what it's like to lose and whose, family have maybe left a country behind, but they've grown up here. So they don't necessarily feel that same exact loss, but they know it. There's an empathy there. But then they're also part of suburbs and movements that are gentrifying and pushing other people out.
Yes.
And I think that there aren't really clear answers to so many of these questions. It's not, none of it was about trying to place blame on any one group, but so much of the stuff around, you know, victimization within the media as well. I feel like sometimes it's like also looking at, you know, affluent people from different ethnicities and groups and the kinds of conversations, and they do defy, and racism within those groups as well. You know, even by just sort of putting people into stereotypes where they're always sort of made to be the victim or hard done by, or really inside just one sweet kind of one-dimensional character is also just bullshit.
Yeah, it's very, very reductive.
It's super reductive. So yeah, so I guess those things were incredibly huge in the driving force of wanting to write this book. And that stuff came naturally because of years of, unbeknownst to me in some ways, but years of research.
Yeah, it's like you were doing your own apprenticeship without quite realizing it.
Yeah.
We're almost out of time, but I did have one final question, and it kind of follows on from it follows on from that idea of representation. Voice sometimes is translated as representation in the context of things like own voices, stories or narratives. I'm not going to ask whether, you kind of touched on this already actually, but I wasn't going to ask whether the narrator is based on you or what is and isn't fiction, because frankly, I've had those kinds of questions myself and I find them really boring and reductive, to repeat that word. Like, oh, you couldn't possibly have had the, you know, the capacity to invent characters or events, you know, like, we know this is not true. But I did want to touch really briefly to finish on that idea of voice as representation. Like, you as a young Australian Indian author have written a protagonist who is also, I think she calls herself Anglo-Indian.
Mm-hmm.
Your protagonist is also a writer, a journalist, and you both seem to have this anthropological, almost ethnographic interest in people and communities and place. You're both of a similar age, you live in the same city, blah, 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 blah. Again, I'm not interested in sort of the idea of autofiction or anything like that, but I guess, what does it mean to see yourself in fiction as a writer, but also as a reader?
Yeah, I think it was a really interesting one, because in some ways this character didn't need to have my particular markings. And I thought about it for a really long time. And part of the decision in the end was, and I really thought about, actually, the main thing I thought about playing with was ethnicity.
Mm-hmm.
And for a long time, I actually also thought that I wanted to make her Anglo completely, because I was really worried through a whole series of previous experiences of the book just becoming a kind of race, identity politics, representative work, and that it might not be treated as literature if I deigned to put someone who was not just white in it. Until really, and even the first couple of weeks, like right until the book was published, I've just been, and you know, it's its own little battle that goes on about representation and race. So I actually thought, for that reason, that I would make her something else, a different, you know, background. But in the end, we write so much because we don't see the things, you know, we write the things we want to see.
Yes.
And in the end, that just became the much bigger calling. And I don't know, I haven't read that many books about, you know, people who especially deal with kind of mixed race.
Yeah, something that struck me when I was reading it was, you know, we can always afford to read and publish more, certainly, but I could think of, you know, many books about the migrant experience, you know, as if it's some monolith, but far fewer books about what it means to exist as either third culture or mixed race.
And second generation and born in another country and these things. And so, yes, of course, through personal, you know, quandaries and issues around it, of course. But also decision to make a lot of the characters, so the characters in the house and the characters that she comes across from different backgrounds, and many of whom are also mixed race. And I just wanted to have the conversations straight up And so I got the characters to talk about some of those issues. And I realized that it was, I wanted a book that explored aspects of that. I didn't want the whole thing to become a kind of, identity politics piece.
Of course.
But I really did, I wanted to fit identity politics into literature. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Kavita. We're flat out of time, but thank you so much for joining us. Thank you everyone else for joining us. And if you've not read Friends in Dark Shapes yet, do pick up a copy from your local bookstore or your library. It's out through Text Publishing in Australia, and it's a beautiful, beautiful read. That is a wrap on our first live session for Toolkits this year. It'll be available to revisit on YouTube in coming days.
Thank you so much for having me, Jennifer, and Express Media as well. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for coming along. I think we are about to get shafted, but I will say on Thursday, the 20th of May at 6 p.m. Australian Eastern Standard Time, our graphic narratives facilitator, Claudia, will be joined by Pat Grant for the next Toolkits Live installment. So you can tune in on the Express Media YouTube page, just like you are now. And I will be back in a few weeks with Elizabeth Tan, who's the author of Rubik and Smart Ovens for Lonely. I always want to say lovely people, lonely people. Anyway, until then, tschüss.